On this week's show, we'll look back at the Industrial Revolution and see what lessons we can learn as AI tries to revolutionize the world at possibly even more breakneck speed. I promise it'll be interesting. It is a history episode, but this history is actually super fascinating and pretty relevant to all of the bullshit we're dealing with today.
Yeah, I just am blown away, man. Like the domino effect of the Industrial Revolution it's like that, I sort of say right now, like we're in this moment in time where they'll look back in 2,000 years and there'll be the era, the Industrial Revolution, and then whatever they call this era, right? Like the beginning of super intelligence, whatever.
Right.
But it was vast, man.
I think that's the thing. We'll get into it, but like there are historians who talk about like we probably maybe should just think of it as the Great War because World War One is required to create World War Two, right? Like World War Two wouldn't have happened. All of history wouldn't have happened if the things before it hadn't happened. But genuinely, like you cannot think about those 60 years without understanding all of the things that are going on and connecting to one another. It does, I don't know, there's a version of me that thinks maybe the Industrial Revolution 1800 to like 2100 is actually going to be the period because it's hard to divorce. We've had weird little lulls in between, but yeah, there's a lot that has drastically changed. We'll get into that. But before we get to all of that, we'll wait for the car behind Andrew to stop zooming past. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. Here's where we do an ad break for OpenAI. ChatGPT is the best. Blah, blah, blah.
It really is.
Gross. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Process Stories, where we talk about systems and frameworks that software teams use to get their work done. So today's topic is whether the AI revolution is comparable to the Industrial Revolution and what lessons we should be learning from the past. I will say, in researching all of this, I thought about my grandfather, who was born in 1925, and how he would look at 2025. And obviously, it's definitely, an evolved world 100 years later, but I think he would have recognized office jobs and city versus suburban versus rural communities. And like, I don't think he'd be surprised by the iPhone probably, but not like our life is different, but compared to his, I don't know, it doesn't feel that different. But if you think about how much the Industrial Revolution like reshaped the world during the 1800s and through the early 1900s, if you think about his grandfather and what he would have looked at 1925 as, being born in 1825, like that world shift is wild. Someone born in 1825 had a life that looked pretty similar to 1725. In fact, their life probably looked pretty similar to 1425, right? Like your life didn't change that much. But by 1925, the Industrial Revolution has fully reshaped, like literally the planet looks different in just 150 years. It's wild what happened.
I think that's the common. That's the way I learned in high school. The sort of common consensus from the professors and teachers was things hadn't changed that dramatically since the caveman days, right? They lived in, people they lived in better quarters, but the tooling wasn't sophisticated. Like it hadn't reached the level of complexity and intricate sort of designs around that tooling. So yeah, I think it was just a leap. It was like literally a leap for mankind over that period of time, right?
Well,
And it
yeah.
all started in Britain, right?
Well, we'll get to that, yes. So I will say, I'm not sure that the AI revolution is going to, I mean, assuming the bubble doesn't burst and any day now we're all immiserated by the failure of the 47% of our GDP locked up in the AI bubble currently. But I'm not sure the AI revolution, if and when it comes, is going to be quite as like physically and literally drastic to our lives. Maybe, but it's hard, like, obviously it's hard to predict the future and know any of that, but I think economically and socially, it'll be just as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution. But I don't know, there's part of me that looks at this and says, we've been coddled by the last 60 years of post-industrial, like, middle-class stability, and with the caveat that a bunch of people didn't get that middle-class stability, but there are signs that this current pace of AI adoption and the things that people want to do as a result of that, it's going to break a lot of things. And so I think the goal of this episode is to look at the Industrial Revolution and see if there's any lessons that we can learn and comparisons that we can draw and sort of prepare ourselves to understand what are the potentials, what does this look like in the past, what should we be mindful of. I'm also going to caveat for everybody, neither of us are historians or economic experts or anything. We haven't spent years and years dissecting all the nuances of, 200 years of history and change. And I've still got, dozens of questions I wish I could just sit down and ask somebody. But broad strokes, this is, research that we've done, how we want to talk about all of this. And obviously, I don't know, reply in the YouTube comments about small details that we got wrong, but I think we have the broad strokes down.
So I think it's interesting, right? Because I agree with you. Like the physical versus the cognitive. That's where I get lost when I think about the two in comparison, right? Because the physical world, it's sort of everybody's a participant, right? It doesn't matter what level of education you came from. Like you can see and become an expert in something in the physical world and then think about the next version of that. Or like, why does it have this? It would be much quicker if I just took this thing off and it's less safe, but I can do things twice as fast. But cognitive doesn't work that way, right?
Right.
Software and like technology doesn't work that way. Finance doesn't work that way. Biotech doesn't work that way. The average Joe can't peer into molecular structures and chemicals and just say, oh, why do you take that molecule and attach it to this? And Bob's your uncle. So it's just fascinating because it's yeah, the physical and the cognitive as we get into that. And then, yeah, the economical break, I shouldn't call it a break, but the
Well,
economics change, right? The
right.
economics change like
Well, and I think
dramatically.
it's interesting that the Industrial Revolution is both. It is physical and mental, and it is something where you couldn't predict, and we'll get into this, I guess, but like, you wouldn't have been able to tie the relationship between the discovery of the electron and all of the things that they figure out about nuclear, radiation and all of those things. No one in 1940 predicts, well, maybe they do, but I haven't found any evidence of it. You're not predicting that a radiologist is a new type of doctor and job, and the lab tech who has to operate the MRI machine. Like, technically, there are these things that have these downstream consequences that you can't possibly predict at the time. And so it is very hard to wrap our brain around how to compare it to now. And we'll talk through all of those sort of comparisons and the things that they did and didn't realize at the time, and how we can try to use that to predict what's going to happen if AI really does start to take off. So I do want to just do I don't know how brief it'll be, but I think we need to talk about what the actual Industrial Revolution looked like. Because one, I'm a history nerd and I enjoy talking about this kind of stuff, but it is genuinely
Yeah.
fascinating how there's some similarities to things today. So, what was the Industrial Revolution? Technically, two industrial revolutions. There was the first one was steam engines, trains, coal power, and moving a bunch of people to factories and like the machine processing that changed a bunch of things in the early 1800s. And then a second revolution, which was around the early 1900s when we got to, electricity, cars, and mass production of things. Yeah.
And where did all of that take place?
Yeah, we'll get to there. You're jumping ahead in the outline. So I do think it's interesting, though, that it follows sort of an interesting pattern of steam engines is a new energy source that leads to trains and factory capabilities. And electricity is a thing that leads to cars and, well, electricity and oil, I suppose, leads to cars and the type of mass manufacturing that you see in the 1900s. And I just thought that was an interesting parallel. It's always a new energy source driving a new type of transport and production output, which we don't technically have today. We're jumping the gun here on the AI revolution. AI might make a little bit more sense had we figured out fusion and we were getting a new energy source to power it, but we've jumped the gun. So it was massive. Obviously, we started to talk about 90% of workers in 1790 were on a farm, And by 1925, it was closer to just 20% of all workers were still on the farm. And it shifted a bunch of all of that work from rural to urban and factory work. And it also sort of changed fundamentally how you existed, most likely. You used to provide for yourself and your family and then your community. And now you were working for someone else, and that someone else was getting the reward and giving you a little bit of that. It's a full cultural, economic shift of everything.
Yeah, so, and for the listeners, if you think about it, back then the farms were probably doing a lot more. They were doing a lot more on the farm, right? Things they weren't necessarily even specialized in. But then, as the Industrial Revolution took off, those tasks became the specialization of somebody else, and the farm now can focus on what they do best, right? Farming, but they can hire the services, right? And that's where the economy and the boom came from, right? Is people who could just specialize in, hey, I'm the farmer and I'm no longer fixing my own equipment. I'm sending it to the town because there's some guy who has a machine that can just focus on that. And so, yeah,
Sure.
it's just a completely different way of life. Like, yes, it's insane. It
Yeah.
really is.
So I do think an important part of this history is why did it happen in Britain and a little bit the Netherlands? So the British and the Dutch are really the big drivers of the Industrial Revolution. And yet, if you look at the world in 1790, China is the most technologically advanced society on the face of the earth. France is a colonial power. I don't think they're quite as a colonial power yet, but what's so special about Britain and the Netherlands? I think an important part of that is the historical context, right? The Industrial Revolution doesn't just happen on a random Tuesday. All of the history leading up to it. This is the problem with all history is you can't actually ever talk about one event because you do need to appreciate everything that came before it. Kamala Harris was right. You exist in the context of everything that came before you. So the British Empire at this point has colonies everywhere. So do the Dutch. The Dutch have the Dutch East India Trading Company or whatever, and they are ruining the planet, going around trying to figure out how to take from other places the things that they don't have back home. And so there's a bunch of things that have already happened by the time you get to the Industrial Revolution. The British Agricultural Revolution, colonialism, and slavery. You can't not understand that those three things make it unique to Britain and China in a way that isn't happening everywhere else. So one, Britain has the agricultural revolution, where since the 16 and 1700s, the process of farming has actually evolved, and it's called the revolution because you suddenly are creating food surpluses through better farming practices, through better farming techniques. I'm going to say better with a giant caveat that a lot of it was because the aristocracy had these things called enclosure acts where you used to get to farm on the common land, and then an earl would show up and be like, well, this common land's near me, so I'm going to take this as my land, and now you, the common farmer, don't get to farm it anymore. Hey, do you want to rent this land from me? I will let you do that and continue to farm. And that drove a bunch of people out of farming into cities looking for work. So yes, farming technically got more efficient as people consolidated, and there was technical improvement throughout this entire time, but it drives a population boom and a population that has less to work on. So there's a bunch of people sitting around trying to figure out what they can work on. The colonial powers are going all over the world, finding spices and silks and all of these things that they don't produce back home. And it forces them to start to look at things and go, okay, I'm investing all of this money, all of this sweat, blood, and tears going over into these colonies, doing horrible, questionable things, but it's bringing all of this stuff back. Or why couldn't I figure out how to do this better back home? And so it does genuinely start to create this challenge of, well, only the rich are getting the crazy fancy lace and porcelain and all of these things that we're importing from overseas. So what if I could figure out a better way to spin cotton into something that I could turn into a textile? So it creates this weird environment for innovation.
And it's probably interesting when you think about the regulations today. It's like if this is the second or third wave of the revolution, right? Britain and the Netherlands were not beholden to the same IP laws and regulations as today, right? Like we just went in those countries and we took the best people and we took the best machinery that and techniques that they were using. We just copied it, right? Or we took it.
Right.
There
And
was
I mean,
no
yes, there was a ton of legal incentive to let the little lordling over in Lancashire go and create the spinning jenny, and the spinning jenny is the way that he automates the ability to do a bunch of textile work, and now they get to the aristocracy and the structure in Britain was already saying, oh, actually, I don't have to take on any of the risk. I'm going to license this corporation to go and create the East India Company and have them do all of the things and have them take all of it. So there's already this bubbling up of this idea that someone else can go and take on the risk, do the work for me, and I get some profit and reward out of it. And so they were encouraging it. They were encouraging the guy to go and create the automation piece. And then other people were saying, well, I'm going to just look at your pattern and I'm going to copy it and do my version of it. Sometimes they did that, what we would call illegally, but back then through, no one was enforcing it. But sometimes there was genuine partnership. Sometimes you read a lot of these stories about these guys who are like, oh yeah, here's this thing that I'm doing. I'm stuck. What you go and take the next step and you hook it up to a steam engine, and the steam engine is now the thing that's going to go and do it. And I'm going to get a little cut of the factory that you just created with my steam engine based version of like, there's just a bunch of incentive to do all of that.
There's also, you start to think about like the people who are wired similar to the way we are, right? We look at a piece of machinery and be like, okay, if I abstract this piece of machinery, like, yeah, it does it on pasta and it comes out this way. It's like, I could take that same piece of machinery and adapt it. And so you've got all these minds suddenly awakening that are architecture brains, right? Where it's like, holy crap. It's like, the guys who figured out bubble gum and it was supposed to be like the rubber for a wheel, right? It's like all of these weird inventions, but they were just people looking at stuff saying, well, if it can do that, then I can probably use it for this. And so there's just this massive opportunity to look around the physical world and say, I can take that over there and do the same thing. It's, it's wild. I'm jealous when I think about it.
So part of this also is China has all of this already, right? So if we want to think about like what are the factors that are driving this? Why is the most advanced civilization in the world at the time not also trying to figure this out? And one of the factors is China has naval command of the Western Pacific and doesn't have these problems. The Spice Islands are in their backyard. They're making the silk. They're trading with India for the textiles and the things. They're the ones producing porcelain. So China's incentives to find new things, necessity is the mother of invention. That is a thing that drives part of this story, which is China was sitting around going, why would I do anything harder? I've got a bunch of people. I've got population growth because we are having our farming is equally capable, and they all need to do work in our society, and everything's good actually. And so it's an interesting thing of those situations of like, what are the factors that drive things? It's just really fascinating history to me of just like the what ifs of so one of the next things we'll get to in a second is just the availability of coal was different in China and mainland Europe compared to Britain, and just by chance that's what happens. I will say the one last part of this factor is slavery. You can't talk about this without appreciating that the New World is generating massive amounts of raw materials, and this combination of, well, I'm getting all of this cotton coming from the New World, I'm getting all of these things, sugarcane, all of these things are coming from the New World, and my ability to process them here cheaply is limited by the number of people that I have. And I have a huge demand for Indian textiles, Chinese textiles, all of these things that I'm importing in. If you're a person trying to make money off of that, and you can have all of these mechanical improvements to human output, and you have a ton of supply coming in from the New World from free labor, you now have an interesting incentive to amp up your domestic production, compete with the people who are trying to bring in overseas materials, and your costs are so much better because of slavery. So it is this really crappy part of this as well that you can't divorce from what's going on in the transatlantic slave trade and all of that as part of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I've often thought about that. It's that I always bring in the T factor, right? Like the time. So England and the United States and the Netherlands and the Western world we got away with it, right? And propelled ourselves to the forefront of tech, and America, the forefront of militarization and stuff. And then you look at today where everybody complains about the regulations and how third world countries in China, they're not sticking to the regulations. It's like when we went through our explosive growth, we
Yep.
didn't have any regulations either. We didn't give a crap about what we did, and we basically enslaved entire nations of people. But yeah, sure, let's, we're more civilized now, so let's prohibit the growth of other countries. And I always struggle with that because it is, yeah, on one hand, I'm like, yeah, they're destroying the planet. But on the other hand, I'm like, yeah, we did that too. We just supposedly are more civilized now, and it's very odd.
Yeah, which is a very Western word and very Western way of looking at things, and a little bit of whataboutism.
I often think too, is that's one of the fundamental differences between our political views too, right? As a conservative, I'm just like, yeah, deregulate. Like, just go. We just go,
You're
right?
not though, really, because you have no problem with massive corporations screwing the little guys by locking them out of it. Like any conservative is going to die on the hill of copyright and patent protection to lock in their Silicon Valley monopolies over things. So that's true up until you have the monopoly position, and then capitalists immediately flip and start saying, well, I'm going to use the law to my benefit to block out the next innovator.
No, no, no. We protect
Yeah,
ourselves in that.
sure, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But
selfish.
when it comes to like industry and the planet, it's basically like we sort of have the same attitude as the Industrial Revolution, where it's like, eh,
Yeah, and then
planet's going
London
to be
was a
fine. It's made of rock. What's going to happen?
no, London was a smog-choked hellscape because of the Industrial Revolution. Like it was bad for a bunch of people. We'll get into why it was bad for workers. It's yeah, no. There's a better way forward. So, colonialism, agricultural revolution, slavery, cheap goods, competition with foreign goods, and a workforce that has been driven from their primary source of work. You put on top of all of this just a sheer quirk of fate that the Isles of Britain, what is that? The British Isles. Wow, that was a phrase. The British Isles just coincidentally have huge coal deposits, but the coal deposits are near the surface. So the mining isn't that, I mean, the mining sucks, all mining sucks, but the mining isn't as hard as in other places. And it's an island. So no matter where you are, you're kind of always close to the coal mine versus China. China has a ton of coal in the middle of nowhere, nowhere near their population centers. So if it's 1790 and your choice is going and trying to figure out how to get all of your workers out into the middle of nowhere to produce the coal output that's going to drive all of this, why would you do that? Versus in England, it's right over there. It's like 20 miles
Yeah,
away from where everyone lives.
it's in Wales. So thank God for the Welsh, because that's what we did. We just send them into the coal mines, right? It's like
Right. No,
when you get
it's
down there, just fill the buckets and send it up. And we gave them some songs, and they were fine.
good. Yeah, sure.
The
Definitely.
men of Morgana rise against the foe. The foe was us, but
Yeah,
they
yeah.
eventually turned those songs into rebellion and stuff like that. But the Welsh, go watch Wrexham, whatever the show is about, the Brian Reynolds and stuff. They're all coal miners' kids. So that is what Wales is all about.
Well, and so because you've got easy access to an energy source, the energy source is drastically better than the previous energy source, which is charcoal. And charcoal comes from cutting down forests, and they'd cut down all the forests. So now, what was the next thing that they were going to use was coal. Coal sucks to mine. They can use the power of coal in this new thing called a steam engine, and the steam engine can drain the mine of all of the water that floods in there, making it slightly safer for the workers and keeps the mine open longer. And so it just creates this self-reinforcing feedback loop. I need more coal. So I can power the steam engine. The steam engine helps me make more coal. Coal is starting to power these other things. Hey, to your point earlier, that steam engine It's just turning a wheel. What else do I have that turns a wheel? The grain mill that's powered by the river has a giant water wheel on it. I could power that by the steam engine instead. Cool, I'm going to go sell my steam engine to the grain mill. The grain mill now needs more coal. I need to mine more coal. It's this constant cycle of all of this stuff. And then they start to realize the steam engine. I could build a train that could move the coal from the coal mine to the city faster. Hey, wait a second, this steam engine can pull a lot of things a lot of distance. I got to build all of the things. So I need to build railways. Railways require steel. Steel requires iron smelting. Iron smelting requires coal. Like it's just this giant. England is literally, and I guess Wales is sitting on top of a giant self-fulfilling prophecy of every innovation drives the previous innovation and the next innovation. And it's a wild runaway cycle. It's really cool conceptually, kind of horrifying what it does to the planet and all of us in 150 years.
I think you brought up a point too. Most people don't realize is like if some of the artwork from that period of time, you look at the beautiful rolling hills, and it's like yes, because there were no trees. Like they
Sure.
stripped the entire country, like New England, Old England, and New England. Like they just stripped the trees during innovation, right? Like that was the train tracks, the steel was placed on wood. Most people don't realize, like, underneath the road, when they're digging up the road, there's big telegraph poles made up, they're trees. So, yeah, they stripped the countryside like it's an unrecognizable place, right?
But the it's one of those things where you think about like in evolution, the things that evolve are often around energy conservation and the most bang you can get for your buck. And animals do things because they can store the fat in the winter, and that helps them do the thing in the spring. And like it is just this. Everything in evolution is about energy conservation and how I can be the most efficient. And it is one of those things where coal, compared to today and a bunch of other options, but at the time, the bang for your buck, the amount of energy and output you could generate from an amount of coal and that equal weight and amount of the other energy sources at the time, it is 10x. Like it is astronomically more effective to use coal. And so it just turns on a bunch of options that just physically hadn't been available before. And it's crazy what that does in terms of every new thing that they can come up with. So all of a sudden, you need a factory to produce the rail lines so that you can run the trains, so that you can have the people who need to service the trains. And the trains are delivering things to new locations. And those new locations are like, it is just this constant thing where this brand new energy source suddenly just flips the switch on a bunch of new things that all need to support one another. You need to build up this one new pillar of capability, and all of a sudden you need 30 other pillars supporting it and driving all of these things. And so we'll talk about the impact on the workers, but there is this weird trade-off of, I don't know if you used to be a farmer and providing just for your wife and your local community, your life was probably much better than working 16 hours in a factory, but the 18 new industries that evolved around you and all of those people who got to work, there's this weird trade-off and balancing act.
Yeah, and think about it. It's everywhere, right? It's boilers are suddenly more efficient, longer running. So now people are just starting to probably shower more, right? Like,
Not until the
so
1900s, but
I'm just saying, like, it's a lot easier to heat water, and it just every single aspect of life changed so
yes.
rapidly.
Yes. Well, not as rapidly. So we'll get into that in a little bit on the impacts on labor. There is this weird thing where it feels rapid to us and it felt rapid to pieces of people, but it's we'll talk about it. The timeline is surprisingly not as condensed as I think my perception of it was. So you have all of these improvements and in innovations driving a new energy source, driving new capabilities, and you have all these people who realize they can use mechanization to improve hand processes. Weavers and a bunch of people get put out of work because they come up with spinning devices that can do textile work. But all of that is still hand driven. It's wood and it's a bunch of things that are creating automation, but that automation is still a person spinning a crank, and the crank spins 40 other cranks. And so that one person does the work of 40, and then the steam engine arrives, and all of a sudden, no humans involved at all. They hook up the crank to the steam engine, and the steam engine starts spinning 1,000 of those things. And so it's this sudden explosion in capacity and capability. And that does mean that domestic production can start to increase. And though the quality isn't as good as what you had been importing from India and China and otherwhere, the price is good, and it's close enough, and they've stolen all of the interesting patterns and techniques from all of those places and implemented an okay version, and they start to do more innovation, and cotton starts to get better thanks to slavery in the New World. And there's all of these things that start to happen. And so cheaper but not as good wins. They literally cripple the Indian economy by the 1830s because they've fully replaced the domestic demand for what they had been importing from India. India had been like, oh, we know how to do this. We're going to, get a bunch of people to start supporting these traders who are showing up. And England basically says, nope, we're going to do it ourselves. We have all of this automation and factory work and all of the people to do it because we drove them off the farms and they now need work in the factories. And it's this really just like, I think it's an early precursor to what you find today, which is a lot of the, Amazon t-shirt that you buy, which is produced in, a country somewhere else and shipped overseas. Is the quality as good as if you'd paid the single person to do it well? No, but everyone wants it cheaper, not necessarily as good a quality. And it's one of the early signs of like, that's a consumer driven choice that's actually technically worse. You're getting inferior product, but it's cheap and it looks close enough. And so it turns out you didn't really need the really fancy silk and the really fancy blouse. You were good enough with the thing that they produced out of the factory, and it's just like a sign of things to come.
People's clothes must have been pretty boring too, right? Because the clothing dye didn't become a thing until the Industrial Revolution, right? So people were just pretty much walking around in black, brown, and
Genuinely, that is a thing that drives the market factors of the Industrial Revolution is all of these fabrics. Now, the fabrics are coming in for the aristocracy mostly and some of the upper crust, but people are looking around going, holy cow, she's not just in this, hand knit white blouse. It's got floral patterns and it's got all of these intricate things. It's got silk, what's it called? When they dye the silk and the pattern, like it's got all of these things that they're noticing are coming in from outside, and they're trying to figure out how can we do that. And there are entire things where they destroy foreign industry because they steal the pattern and the template, and then they figure out how to reproduce a good enough version domestically. And yet genuinely by the 1850s and 1860s, people's fashion has fully changed because of this as well. Absolutely.
yeah, yeah. It's like the world went to color, right?
A little bit, yeah,
Yeah,
but not because of anything that they innovated. That's fully stolen and imported. They still don't have dyes domestically. They're still importing all of that and doing it for themselves.
traded,
No,
traded.
no.
We took education and medicine there, and those countries gave us their spices and their dyes and things.
I don't know that I would say education at the tip of a bayonet is a good
But
education.
let me. Oh, we were cruel.
Yeah, no,
We were
not
cruel.
great.
Yeah.
So I think an important factor of all of this is we've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to drive home that because of a bunch of factors, China didn't need to do things this way. They had some, not cultural, but just like the way their society was formed, they had still a monarchy, and the monarchy did allow for innovation, but they wanted a finger in the what's a finger in the pie? Is that the metaphor? I don't know. But there's a capitalistic capacity in Britain and the Dutch and the French eventually that allows for the creation of these corporations, these trade routes, these things that can drive these local domestic production. And it eventually, like, it leads to all of these things, right? So the ability to trade cotton overseas leads Eli Whitney to create the cotton gin to make that a more profitable thing for him, all the way through the Second Industrial Revolution when JP Morgan funds Edison to do all of the electrical work. The incentives of the capitalists are not able to be separated from this. We didn't do this because it was cool technology. We did it because it made people richer. And sure, there were some downstream impacts that we'll talk about, but it's a capitalistic drive that really powers most of the Industrial Revolution. And yes, there's innovation as part of that. Yes, you do have to figure out, okay, I now have a new entire class of people who are the factory owners, and the factory owners now go home to a house that's not staffed the way the aristocracy is staffed, but they are working at the factory, coming home. So the family needs the services, they need the appliances, they need the things. Like, it does suddenly create this incentive to make the life of this, not quite, I don't know what I want to call it. It's not the middle class as we think of the middle class today, but it is this new class of owner, producer, capitalist. And you, over decades, start to create entire new industries from scratch. And we'll talk about the economics later, but it's fascinating that there's this balancing act of the rich got richer. Let's not say the rich didn't get richer, but there is technically a new class that starts to form. And over 150 years, that starts to expand.
Yeah, yeah. The rich definitely got richer, and they're producing at a higher rate, but they're also able to redefine life, right? Like the work week and overtime, and that happened a few hundred years ago, a couple of hundred years ago too, right? Like people 100 years ago, there were people working after hours. So yeah, industry really changes, and when you look at the context, I always joke about, like, I'm a blacksmith. If you call me at 2 a.m. with a tech issue, like, I'm on it, right? Like, I live my career. But during the Industrial Revolution, the blacksmiths sort of die, right? Like, it moves to being like big manufacturing and fixed in a factory where someone's always working. Like, there's always something going on in the factory. So, but there's also sort of visionaries in that too. And actually, where I grew up, Sir Titus Salt is like this visionary who sees it all differently for his workers. So we should talk about Sir Titus Salt as we go through this, because this is a man who built a town for his workers, complete with plumbing and all the indoor amenities that weren't prevalent in Britain at the time. And, yes, he gave the managers the bigger houses and his workers had the smaller houses. But there's this guy who just conscientiously built his textile business and cared for his workers. So there's some really interesting stories in there of people who wanted to do it your way, I guess, that when you were always saying, like, I could be part of the change, this was one of those shining sort of guys in the middle of the Industrial Revolution who's not taking advantage of his workers, but sort of saying, like, we'll share the love. He truly
I will
was. He
I will
truly
have
was a
to
pioneer.
research that. I will have to research that before I believe a company town has never once been good for the workers. Living in a company town where you have to go to the company doctor and the company grocery store, and
He,
you pay back the money that they already gave you, so your wages are actually lower
you
than
will
what they are
be
because you owe the company back
pleasantly
the rent.
surprised that
Okay,
Sir
we will
Titus
see.
Salt was a humanist. His
Sure. All right.
foundation was a humanist. He's like you.
The only one. So I do think, the Industrial Revolution gives rise to a bunch of new things, and some of them good, some of them bad, right? So monopolies are a thing that used to only be the government, right? Basically, governments were monarchies effectively for 2,000 years, and the crown had the monopoly. And by the time the Industrial Revolution is over, U.S. Steel, General Electric, Standard Oil, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, all of these corporations are the ones who have the final say and have the monopolies over things and are exerting the influence. And so it opens up the door in a way to challenging the monarchy, challenging the standard way that the world operated for, almost 2,000 years at least, if not longer, right? It's like, it's not good. Monopolies are terrible and bad, but it is interesting that it allows that shift away from, you had to have the pure blood. I mean, not really. You still, the families today would love to keep it in the family, but it is a change. It's a change to allowing something else to be the structure around the world, around which the world is formed. I'm assuming you want to defend the monarchy or something. I don't know.
No, no, like
Or
the
defend Standard
purebloods
Oil.
and the mudbloods. No, I
Yeah.
mean, I am pro monarchy. I'm the only one in my family who's pro monarchy, but yeah, I don't have a problem with the royal family.
So one of the like really kind of cool and interesting things is the Industrial Revolution basically invented time. And I'm only kind of kidding. Like, time zones were necessary because trains couldn't work across great distances without actually having a standard way of keeping time and understanding what was going on. And it started to enforce timetables and the concept of a standard way of perceiving time. You thought about time before this in relation to your day and in relation to the things you had to do. And yeah, you probably at some point in the past couple hundred years before that had the town square clock tower or something, but all of that was relative. And by the end of the 1800s, they've standardized on Greenwich Mean Time and trying to figure out how to do all of that. It also, just because of manufacturing, drastically spikes the number of clocks, pocket watches, stopwatches, wristwatches. Like, the actual ability to manufacture metal at scale means suddenly a bunch of new products are available. And one of them is a clock. You can figure out how to build these tiny little gears and coils and things that keep relatively accurate time on your person. And so time actually becomes a new thing. That's good and interesting in a bunch of ways. It's bad because the factory manager now has a very strict way of keeping you on job and on hours that you've worked. It's no longer about sundown and sun up. It's about how many hours you've put in. But it's a really fascinating thing that most of the time before the 1800s, time was just, yeah, it's noon. It's, yeah, we had the
Well,
concept 2 p.m., but like
it
everyone's 2 p.m. was a little different.
it also shifts the mentality of the folk from the church tells us what time it is to the factories tell us what time it is, right? The church
Right.
bells, the church bells stopped being the beacon throughout the day, and it was now the factories. So before that, Rome owned the time. Henry VIII, England,
There
Church
you
of
go.
England, but yeah, the church owned time before that.
Yep. Ironically, the Industrial Revolution also leads to some pretty great art. So, writing, painting, a bunch of things try to grapple with this massive cultural and sociological shift. And so when the farmer is no longer producing for himself and is paid a wage to produce for someone else and only get a cut of his own labor, like, it leads to these existential questions, and that creates good art. And at the same time, obviously the printing press has been around for a while, but the ability to have people thinking in different ways, grappling with big questions in different ways, it genuinely starts to produce things like the Penny Dreadful and the periodical. These horror stories are the way that people who have access to leisure time and dealing with their own thought processes in a way that they didn't have time to do before suddenly produce these kinds of things. And it's fascinating. It's a thing AI wants to get rid of, but it's really just interesting that a bunch of cool and interesting stuff comes out of this massive upheaval. It does lead to the robber barons. We've talked about the monopolies, but like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, all of these anti-competitive, anti-worker monsters, basically, who run all of these corporations throughout most of this time. It creates this class of people, and I don't want to lose sight of how bad that is. And we have the weekend thanks to unions, and the unions were necessary because these guys were terrible for their workers. So as we talk about the impact on work, you can't lose sight of it was not good. It might have eventually created a middle class, and it did so at different degrees and in stops and starts. But there's a lot of bad stuff that happens in the Industrial Revolution to get to the rose-colored 1950s glasses.
I'm surprised you liberals don't want like a Jimmy Hoffa day, because I know how much you love your unions over there.
I mean, listen, all human things get corrupted by people in power. I'm not going to defend the corruption of unions, but the concept of the union is better than the dictator king who gets to tell you how to live. So,
We
yeah, a
we
little
took
bit.
we took care of Jimmy. Don't worry about
Yeah.
it. He's got problem
uh,
solved.
yeah, there you go. It also shrunk the world. So, steam engines basically, and eventually oil and electricity, eventually fully change how you think about the world. A train will get you someplace in days or hours that used to take weeks or months. And basically everything changes. Steamboats, engines, cars, all of these things drastically shape the way you think of the world. Commerce, all of a sudden, if I'm a textile producer in Chicago, I do actually have some options. I could be producing the most amazing thing that people want on Fifth Avenue in New York, and that's an option for me now. And so it opens up a bunch of doors. Vacations become a thing, mostly for the rich, but wanting to be able to go down to the Atlantic shore when you lived 5 hours away, it's now an option for people, and eventually that does get bigger. So it's, migration. You can cross the ocean in a couple of days now. Like there's all of these things that really do start to change. And I don't know, we're going to keep saying it. The world
Yeah.
drastically changes because of this,
And telegraph poles, right? Like wiring, like news becomes
right?
a thing. News becomes a thing where you're getting it. You're getting a telegram. Like, I don't know when the telegram was invented, um,
1840s, I
but
think.
1840s, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're getting news now. Like you've got this. The first version of the internet, right, is
Sure.
the telegraph poles. They don't go under the ocean yet, but they start to span countries and, well, civilized ones like the UK.
We're going to drop the
Um,
word civilized from your vocabulary one of these days.
uh, but yeah, it's that's massive.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
just, yeah, information at record speeds.
I do think also it's important. So we'll start to talk about the impact on labor, but this isn't a thing that happens in 2 decades, right? This is 150 years of change. And when you look at a history book and you see each of the things it's hard to contextualize how long that is. But like by 1830, there's a global recession because all of these initial adoptions of steam engines and railways driving places and producing things, it actually like everyone's like, oh, okay, we've got this now. We're all at parity again. And it's 1840 with the telegraph and the some of the new technologies that they have around the first uses of electricity don't actually really help. It takes until the 1870s to actually have the second industrial revolution start up and steel production and electricity and all of these things actually starting to really take advantage of the past 70 years of innovation. And so 70 years of innovation drives a bunch of more changes, but those 70 years still had to happen, right? So whether you are a farm worker who's not working on the farm, actually a ton of people are still working on the farms by the 1850s. Like these things happened and they were drastic, but I don't know. It's hard to structure my brain around. It was actually kind of incremental as far as I can tell. And punished individual types of workers one at a time. I don't know. It like we're going to get into the impact on the workers, but it's interesting how our brains struggle with giant time periods and giant changes like this.
Yeah, I always think of those people who live to 100. Like I always, certainly around like the 1900s, anybody born in like, 1900, and they make it 100 years. They've seen some insane shit, right? Because they've gone from industrial revolution, right, to the effects of the industrial revolution to the beginning of the digital era, right?
Right?
They're going
Nuclear
from
power,
analog to
like a
digital.
whole bunch of things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
they're going
You,
from horses to cars
yep. You can't
to
really
space shuttles.
divorce both world wars are a side effect of manufacturing improvements, right? So there's one of these
Yeah.
statistics down here that basically, thanks to the steam engine, the USA becomes the best producer of bullets. And it's like, fucking, of course,
So
the US becomes the
here's
best producer of
yeah,
bullets.
yeah. But
Great.
here's like where people don't realize, like I read an interesting book about neuroscience, and the effects are tiny, but massive when you look at the scale of things. So during World War One, the caliber of bullet and the speed at which those bullets would enter your head and exit again meant clean exit wounds. They didn't explode in your head. So soldiers would come back from the war with missing regions of their brain. And so brain science like made massive leaps because they'd be like, cool, we've got a guy who can't sing anymore, right? He can speak the
Great.
words, but he can't sing the song. And so brain science like jumps because they now have, because of bullets and the
Sure.
caliber and the guns, right?
I
It's
think a second
crazy.
Well, and a second part of the Industrial Revolution. So, first Industrial Revolution, steam, coal, manufacturing. Second Industrial Revolution, oil, electricity, steel, and metal manufacturing. An interesting side effect also is chemicals, and chemicals become a thing. And so, of course, the very first thing we do with it in World War I is use chemicals on people and see all of the horrifying side effects of all of that. So, good job, Industrial Revolution. Thank you
Yeah.
for giving us new weapons of war. Cool.
Yeah. it kind of supports my theory that we just go charging in, though, right? Like, hey, we figured out how to make mustard gas. Cool. This is going to be awesome. Like, there was no concept of like, isn't this like cruel and mean and like
Yeah,
just
right.
not okay?
The Geneva Conventions did show up and be like, well, okay, we tried that. Maybe less of that next time. And so we're all going to agree
Yeah.
there's a way to fight war. Like, yeah,
I, bet I
not
bet
great.
you I bet you wherever the guys who during the Bronze Age are kind of pissed off, like I bet you they feel like, well, no, damn it, like it was just a big of a leap for us in the Bronze Age, right? Like doesn't come close, guys.
The Bronze Age, ironically, has a giant global recession and collapse, and no one knows why. And it takes us like hundreds of years to come out of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. I will say in the Iron Age, I don't actually know. When is the Roman, like the 200, 300 CE is technically post Iron Age into whatever age they are. They had steam engines. They just couldn't find any use for it. And they just had this giant spinning thing that was powered by steam. And they were like, I guess that looks cool, but we don't know what to do. So, like, again, it just goes to necessity is the mother of invention. The timing wasn't right. We could have been in a completely different world had Rome found the reason to use their steam engines.
That's again, I always say the T factor is so big in all of this, right? Because they were probably like, should we use it for torture and to
Right? It's a new thing for the
amuse Caesar?
Colosseum. Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's like
The Colosseum has
we
a new thing.
yeah, we can steam cook people, right? If they lose,
Right.
it's like that primitive
Yeah.
mindset. But
Yeah.
you're right, like the things that had no place in society because they hadn't gone through the domino effect, right, of all these
Yep.
changes.
Yep. All right. So that's the history. A bunch of unique factors, nothing special about the British themselves. They just happened to be in the right place at the right time and uh, lucked into the Industrial Revolution. So, what does that actually do to the worker, right? So, I think as we talk about our own awareness, why are we even talking about this? Why does this history matter? Let's look at what it did to the worker and why we want to talk about the comparisons to AI today. So, I think one of the fascinating things is you think of the Industrial Revolution as this thing where, like, a bunch of people started showing up in factories and working in the factories, and eventually, like, the farmer got displaced and had to become a factory worker. And we try to compare that to, the factory workers of the 1900s get displaced by the white collar jobs. But what's really interesting is actually the early parts of the first Industrial Revolution is skilled labor, the weavers, the hand weavers, the people who are creating fine artisan crafts in their hometowns for their communities. There's a thing called, like, today we refer to the cottage industry as like a little group of people doing a small thing for a small audience. That comes from right before the Industrial Revolution. It was called a cottage industry where you produced the textiles and the blacksmith and all of the things that you did in your local community, and you traded amongst one another in the out of your cottage together. And those are the people who get replaced first. So the spinning jenny and a bunch of these things that get invented to make manufacturing of textiles easier, make farm work easier, are the first who get replaced. And so, yeah, that thought process of, oh, it's the farmhand who has to do a thing. No, it's the person whose entire livelihood, the way they fed their family, doing really hard, good, skilled work, are the first to go. And annoyingly, because it's the 1800s, I can't find any good historical data. No one's got any good logging of the professions and the number of people that are displaced. So I don't have a ton of great facts, but I do think it's interesting to try to go and pull apart, like, what does that actually look like? How many artisans and craft people are put out of work in the first wave? And even some of the rough estimates are, it's like tens of thousands of people, which at the time, is a good chunk of the workforce. But it's actually, when you look at the statistics, it's not huge. And so there's this weird perception of, like, the people who are getting screwed by these changes are rightly vocal. You're taking food out of their children's mouths in order to go and automate this stuff. But as a percentage of the population, like, you go and look at now, there were farm workers, so farm workers get replaced by the threshing machine, and the farm workers revolt. And so by the 1830s, there's things called swing riots, and the swing riots are the threshers who, it's a back-breaking job, but it's their job, get replaced by a machine that can do it. And yay, automation, I guess you're no longer doing back-breaking job, but you're now out of work. But what's weird is these farmers riot over the fact that they're getting replaced. Because in their communities where the thresher is being implemented, unemployment goes up to 7.6%. The rest of England at the time has an unemployment rate in the 1830s about 5.5%. And so it's weird to think about, like, there are times during the second industrial revolution where unemployment is 16% and the unions are getting pretty violent. The early parts of the industrial revolution, they're getting pretty violent. They're getting pretty reactionary to a bunch of these changes, but the actual scope of the impact is hard to estimate. A 2% unemployment rate change is bad for all of the people. I'm not saying it's not bad for the people who can't feed their families, but the scale of it is surprising to me as you go and try to figure out what the actual things are that were going on at that point. Yeah, so it's just really fascinating that this is where it goes into, there's impacts, absolutely. Profession by profession, you see a lot of skilled people starting to get replaced first, and then it starts to come for the farm workers that are left, and those farm workers start to get replaced by machinery. And yet, if you look at the numbers, so there's a chart. If you watch us on YouTube, I'll put the chart up on the screen right now. But there's a chart from, I'm not going to find the source in time, but there's a chart that will put the link to the source in. And it's looking at the share of occupations from 1860 to today. And in 1860, so we're 60 years into the Industrial Revolution, there's still 40% of people working on farms, right? So it is this thing, it's the second industrial revolution by the mid 1900s that you've seen the pretty much total collapse of farm work. But the 1800s is when you think of people going to factories and how difficult that work is. There was a ton of that work. But look at this chart. It's really fascinating that there is an explosion of that gray line of laborers, that is that production blue line down at the bottom. It increases. There's more people in factories. There's more people doing backbreaking labor. It's pretty bad to be in the factory work, but it hasn't fully, I don't know, like my perception of the Industrial Revolution was full decimation due to all of this machinery, and it's not. It's gradual, it's incremental, and I do wonder that that does have an impact on the ability for people to influence the changes, right? So, okay, yeah, the blacksmith is out of work. That sucks, but I also now get my blacksmith stuff cheaper out of the factory. And then it's 10 years later that the hand weavers are out of work, and it sucks for them. I'm sorry that they're not feeding their families, but I am now getting my textiles and my clothing cheaper out of the factory. And so I do wonder that the gradual evolution of this over like 100 years makes anyone's individual ability to perceive this at the time harder.
Yeah, it's interesting too, right? Because when you start to think about the types of jobs that came up, like the administration and the business and the legal and those back office jobs, but also you're now producing at a speed where there's excess, right? There's excess products. So now you start to think about, well, then marketing and sales started to become a thing, right? Like inventory management started to become a thing. So there's jobs, right? There's this whole back office, which, jumping ahead leads to today, where it's like a lot of those jobs still exist. Accounting, right? Some companies have thousands of accountants. And so it really switches from that blue collar to saying, hey, there's the maintenance, children working during the Industrial Revolution, right? Like,
I mean, that's a whole episode probably of the
it
horrifying
is, but,
conditions.
for some of the listeners, you think about it, like school, like public school is a way to keep the kids out of the factories, and like health and safety,
Well,
isn't really a thing in the beginning, is it?
public education also is a way public education was effectively the capitalist answer to realizing we need to produce this new class of worker because we
Yeah.
need the marketing person and the sales guy. So yeah, the public education is one of those tricky ones. It's not, you're not being sent to Eton so you know how to rule over people properly. You're being sent to work so you can become a good salesperson, office manager, all of those things. It's a tricky, yeah, I'm pro education, but let's not take it out of the context of why a bunch of people supported public education at the end of the 1800s.
And if you're not saying thank you, Great Britain, right now, I don't know
I'm
at what
not.
point in this
I'll,
episode you're
I'll,
going to say thank you.
I will never say thank you to the British Empire. I'll say thank you to all the people they stole from. My numbering system comes from Arabic. I'm very thankful to the Arabs. Thanks.
We
But I
created
do,
paper so they could write it down. So,
yes, the German printing press was dependent on the British paper, sure. So I think this is all really fascinating in our context, right? So You have highly skilled workers who work for themselves, get replaced by this machinery, and then in a lot of cases, there's no alternative, right? So there is just horrifying statistics around things like workhouses were the reaction in Britain to, well, we've got a bunch of unemployed people who can't feed themselves. And I don't know what the right comparison is. They're not quite homeless shelters, but they are this place where you go to do work and live and get fed, but it's like it's the worst type of poverty. And there's a massive increase in people who go into workhouses. There's a massive amount of people who never find new employment. And I think there's a statistic in here somewhere that like by 1861, 20% of UK workhouse residents had been there for more than 5 years. So it is decimating people's livelihoods and putting them into poverty when entire career paths get killed off. A career path is even a word that they wouldn't have had. You used to be one of the town weavers and textile producers. You're no longer that. There is a thing that starts to happen, though, to your point, which is, okay, but we do still need some people who know what the output of the textile process should look like to come work the spinning jennies and then eventually the steam-powered ones and all of those kinds of things. So that factory work does hire back. They weren't ever fired from someplace. They just simply lost the people and the demands for what they were doing by hand. So they get hired to come work at the factories. And instead of working, all day out of your house with your husband and child, you now go to the factory where you work 16 hours a day for much less, and your kid has to work because your kid is part of now the reduced income that you have. Your kid now needs to work to supplement that income. Your husband's off in some other factory somewhere else. Like, sure, you have a job. Are you guys maintaining your standard of living? Maybe it's going down a little bit. So there is this weird thing that happens, which the highly skilled workers don't all just immediately go onto the unemployment line. They do sometimes get jobs in the new industries. And yes, new industries arise entirely. Teachers and office managers and marketers and all of the stuff. Some of that takes like 100 years. So the weaver who got put out of work in 1805, screwed for life. But it is this weird mix of, okay, you're out of a job. What's the new next job that got created? It might take 5 years for that new job to get created, but there was this weird cycle of, okay, well, we now have a factory. We need the factory floor manager. We need the person who's doing all of these things. We have the new textile. The shop down the street is selling someone else's textile. I need the person to work at the shop. There are all of these things that kind of start to create new jobs. So it's this weird balancing act of a bunch of people got genuinely screwed by the Industrial Revolution permanently, and a bunch of people got varying degrees of, oh, actually, I've got kind of a nice life. I work down at the factory and manage the accounting for the factory owner, and that's an okay life. Or no, I'm now working 16-hour days. It's this weird mix for the workers as all of this happens.
Yeah, it's the sting in the gap, right?
I mean, that is where you define those for the people who've never listened to the podcast before.
Yeah, so this thing could be described as when the jobs go away, when whole slices of professions are just wiped away, and then the gap is really that time for innovation and the new jobs coming in, and so you hope that the perfect world, right, is the rate of innovation and new jobs getting created is happening while the sting is happening, but the reality is it doesn't, and that therefore there's a gap between that innovation creating the jobs, and then to your point, even when that you reach that next level of innovation, it's like what's happened with the coal miners today. It's easy for us all to sort of say, like, move, go back to school, stop being a coal miner, like, go do something else, like, it's moved, right? But the reality is it's much harder than that. So those people, will they
Right.
be part of the AI revolution and the digital revolution? Probably not, right? Another
Right.
class of systems left
And
behind.
and you look at the Industrial Revolution, if you were a 24-year-old newly married person who was part of the cottage industry of textile creation, you can probably go and work in the factory. If you were 60 and you were just doing it as a way to keep the income coming into the cottage and you now have to go do factory work, you're not doing factory work. And so it's this weird thing of just like, yeah, your opportunity is dependent on a bunch of factors, whether or not you can survive the gap and you can make it to what the new round of jobs are. And in the Industrial Revolution, and possibly coming up very soon, there's a lot of people, and you could probably argue today, there's a bunch of people who were coal miners who were too old by the time the industry was shut down to go do anything. Like, no offense, but if you're 55 and you're trying to learn HTML and become a programmer, the human brain stops learning very well at a certain point, and that sucks for the coal miner, right? So there's just the unfortunate side effects of how human beings grow old and things change. It's awful and bad for a lot of people. And yes, so the next topic is you can talk about, in theory, it gives rise to the new middle class. I don't love this framing because the middle class that people think of in the like 1950s and 60s post World War II is not the middle class we're talking about here. There is a very narrow slice of people who get to become factory owners without being the, Viscount's son. So yes, there's creating a new opportunity for people in that area. And then there's another subclass of people who get to provide the services to that group of people. So yes, technically new things are invented. And if you're watching on YouTube, I'll put up the chart right now of just the like invention of category of job from 1870 to 1930. It's crazy. There genuinely is just like, oh, crap, I do need to invent a new thing because I now have railroads going and doing. I have railroad stations that need to be staffed by people. You need to eat along the way. So I now have places that you like, all of these things start to invent new parts of the industry and people need to work in them. And so, yes, technically there is a middle class that or a new class of people who in theory are more prosperous. I question whether that's really true. And obviously, I don't know, that inflation is the wrong word, but money meant different things back then. So there's an interesting statistic that by the end of the 1880s, an income of roughly $500 a year would have been the necessary bare minimum for a family of five in a middle-sized industrial town to enjoy like what we would consider even the bare necessities of life. Newspapers, you can go have a beer, hang out with friends and dinner and all of those kinds of things. And the most prosperous workers, which were like locomotive engineers, pattern makers for textiles, glass blowers, like those incomes got up to $800 to $1,100 a year. So basically, income inequality still kind of a thing. You've got entire groups of people making twice as much as their nearest neighbor because it's the skill level that you have at the time. But it's just I'm always fascinated by like inflation and the way money means different things back then. $1,100 a year means you're kind of upper middle class back then. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting too. That this, whenever I think back to, I always think later, like the 50s, where it's like, the family with the TV, the family with the
Sure.
TV, right? Is like, that's a status thing, right? So there must have been like that throughout the Industrial Revolution too. Like, the people who pee inside the house, that was a big deal in England, right? Like their toilets in their house. When I grew up in the 80s, we had an outside bathroom still.
Sure. I mean, yeah, my grandfather's farm in North Dakota had the outhouse was like the
Yeah.
famous thing that all the grandkids went and took a look at. What do you mean you peed outdoors?
So that sort of measured their class, right? Like, oh, he
Right.
pees indoors.
But that is the thing that I'm kind of frustrated in all of this research I've been doing on all of this, which is the numbers aren't really easily available to put all of this in context. So right now, you think of the 1950s middle class as this thing that was broadly applicable. Now, it's the 1950s, so it's the white middle class. But the way we think of the post-baby boom economic growth is a thing that impacts huge swaths of at least America. And what I don't have a good grasp on is, are we trying to like paint a rosier picture of the Industrial Revolution after the fact because there genuinely was a new class of people? Like you don't get to the robber barons, the Vanderbilts and all of those. Maybe some of them had old money, but they definitely weren't, actual aristocracy. So you are creating this concept of a new way of generating wealth at different hierarchies. But I don't have a good sense of like the glass blowers and the locomotive engineers and the pattern makers who are making $1,100 a year and are doing really well. Is that 1% of our society? Is that 30% of our society? Like I struggle. Even you look at the graph of the 1860s to the modern day, a lot of that work, administration, business, financial, legal, it's like 5% of the populace until 1920. I don't know, like it's hard to know whether or not we genuinely actually had like an interesting middle class or it was like the proto middle class for 10% of the country. And it's not until the post World War II that you actually have that become more broadly available. It's not clear from the stats for me at least.
No, it's a weird time too, though, right? Because it's fluid, it's moving, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
you genuinely the American dream at that point is genuinely probably more available to I don't know if I want to say more available, but like right now, your chance of being the next Mark Zuckerberg is 0.00001%. Back then, you might have stumbled on a really interesting thing that you could have done with like shoe cobbling and put together the thing that's taking the past three ideas and becoming the automated shoe cobbler. And now you turn into an asshole and try to put all of the other shoe cobblers in town out of work and they form a union and go on strike. But your opportunity for that does, by the middle to end of the 1800s, does seem much higher and much more likely. Like that's kind of the entire point of that HBO series, The Gilded Age, talking about the end of the 1800s and the guy who is like new money, the new money guy who has railroads. And that is not the guy who the rest of the rich people want to hang around with. Like that was not broadly available to everybody, but much more likely than it was before that, or probably even today.
yeah, it's a weird time.
Yeah. I will say, cool. The rich get richer. A new class of people have the chance to get richer, but it does get worse for a lot of people, right? The working class never really get a good thing out of this. You go from probably an okay life on the farm to some pretty terrible conditions in the factory and working in the coal mines and working in the railroads and the deaths that you face and the factory conditions are terrifying for children, much less adults. It's not great to be the working class during all of this. And I think it's a constant theme of the past I don't know, all of human society, which is we see a bunch of people get things better, but there is always constantly a group of people who don't see the benefit of that and are just constantly in a not great condition. So even into the 20th century, you can talk about the rise of the middle class. It's the white middle class for a while, and it is even, to your point, the coal miners. At some point, the coal miners never have a great life. They're producing for their kids and putting their kids through college, so it's at least something. But then they get screwed. Like I don't know. There's a group of people in this world who always seem to get screwed by these systems.
Yeah, I think it's a really famous case, right? Mary Richards. I heard about it when I was doing my research, and she was I don't even think she was 10. I think she was 9, and she's in one of these workhouses, and she gets her apron caught on the machine, and it basically sucks her in. And everybody in the workhouse is witnessing this 9-year-old child spinning around the machine. And they're like, every bone in her body is basically shattered multiple times. Like she's unrecognizable by the time she comes out of the machine. Like it, and that's just one story, right? Like there's just
Right.
there's just
Yep.
a million horrible stories. A lot of them undocumented too, right? A lot of things that never made it out of those places were never recorded. But yeah, it's definitely a time of exploitation.
Right. Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and so yes, I suppose you could argue if it's 1820 and you were working on a farm and you were working for someone else, then going to the factory, your wages might be a little bit better, actually, depending on where you are. The wages are worse if you used to be the hand weaver. Going to the factory, you get paid less. So the less skilled person who gets to come work in the factory to do the weaving with the machinery is getting paid less than you were, but they're getting paid more than they were. And so it's this weird also trade off of you might think your life is I don't know that you think it's better because you're working 16 hours a day in a factory that's wildly dangerous and no one cares if you live or die or lose a hand or whatever it is, but you are getting paid more. And so it's this weird perverse incentive of the cost of living in the cities like didn't know how to adapt, so you're often living in some pretty terrible conditions, but at least you've got money and at least you are feeding yourself. That's just this constant weird trade-off that people have to make of how you can survive through all of this if you're in that world. And yeah, I don't know that we've ever not had that in varying parts of the world, but it's definitely not helped. Like, okay, cool, everyone's making more money in the factory. I mean, are they? Are they really? They're making more, working worse, and not spending any time with their families. I think that's an interesting side effect of all of this is your home life drastically changed. So you, your wife, and your kids all sat around weaving and doing the thing. Like you all had a home life together, and all of a sudden you all have to go to the factory or the husband goes to the mine while you stay at home and do something else. Like there is a fundamental shift in how families relate to one another as a result of this. And we've never really recovered from that. Like we were talking in the cold open. I don't know if that part of the cold open will make the edit, but like a version of toxic masculinity today yearns for a world that wasn't in the 1950s, it was in the 1750s. Like you had a different relationship to your family and kids and labor and the output of your blood, sweat, and tears provided for people in a way that it hasn't in many, many centuries at this point. And it fully just changed. Even in the 1950s, the perfect housewife stayed at home and did all of the whatever. Like that was a form of labor, uncompensated labor. And the husband left the house for the same number of hours as if he was going to the factory. Like it just fundamentally changed what the family unit was supposed to be.
We need to go back to that. The 50s.
No, nothing about the
Not
50s is
not
good.
totally, but the best
None.
bits of the
Zero.
50s.
Name a good bit of the 50s.
Fashion.
We're already have the high-waisted pants. The high-waisted pants are already back.
Women wore more dresses back then. Classy dresses.
Nope. I'm gonna cut that out.
You
That's
can't
some
cut that
bullshit.
out. Why are you cutting
Your
that out?
misogyny. You want
You
your
can't call me a
misogyny
tug. You
on
can't call me a tech bro and then cut the tech bro bits out.
right.
But it was pretty. People were pretty. They people were pretty back then.
Your standard of pretty is not a thing that needs to be inflicted on women.
It's not inflicted.
It's
There's a lot of people
absolutely
who. There's
inflicted.
a lot of. We should run a poll and see how many people want to go back to the 50s fashion. You'd be
But
surprised
you
at
can
the
go back
numbers.
to the fashion by choice. Nothing about that is it was not voluntary back then, so I don't need to
We
go back
should
to the
encourage it.
50s.
We should
No.
encourage it. Okay.
Fashion is
Just an
cyclical.
idea.
It'll happen on its own. I also think there's an interesting part of all of this, which is, the impact on work. We haven't really touched on unions, and there is a fairly significant part of the economic theories that we'll talk about in probably part two. But an interesting part of all of this, to me at least, was the term Luddite, the idea that somebody is just anti-technology because they're anti-technology. Oh, you're a Luddite. You don't have an iPhone in 2012. You're trying to avoid embracing this digital world. You're a Luddite. I mean, the Luddites were a group of people who were against this machinery in the, I think, 1820s, and they were being put out of work. This machinery was taking food out of their children's mouths and putting it into a single person's hands, and they were against that. And yeah, they were going around destroying the machines that were trying to take their job. I think it's like they got suppressed by the military. Like the British government came in and suppressed the Luddites and killed hundreds of them. And they weren't wrong to be upset that technology was taking away their income. And so it's just fascinating doing the research and realizing, like, actually, that's not a term we should use that way. That term is actually people defending the right from themselves to make money. And they weren't against the technology itself, they were against the use of the technology. And I don't know, I'm kind of pro Luddite now because I get it. I understand. Anyways, I thought that was just a fascinating aside doing all of this research.
I don't know much about the Luddites. It seems like an American thing.
It was 100% in England, so nope.
Don't know anything about them.
Wild.
Sounds like the
Wild.
libertarians or something. It's like, I don't know.
Ugh, libertarians.
I actually agree with some of that stuff. Of course I do.
There was one specific machine, I'm blanking on what it was. Ironically, the machine was produced by a company who also produced massive hammers, and so they would use the massive hammer produced by the company to destroy the company's machines. Kind of funny. But they were being replaced by the machine there, so they were basically a bunch of people in their towns were paying for the machine to replace their jobs, and so they went around destroying every machine that got bought. And basically it was a proto-union strike, but instead it was destroying the machinery that was supposed to to replace them. And the government came in and the government will always be on the side of capital. And so the government arrested and executed like hundreds of them for daring to say, no, I don't think I should be replaced by machinery. And so today, it's a term that gets used to mean, oh, you're just anti-technology. You refuse to embrace the future. And it's like, no, they were being put out of a job pretty horrifically. And this is part of the problem with all of these changes, right? Is this is the sting, this is the gap. You're getting put out of work, and it's not clear to you that in 10 years there's going to be a factory where you could go work. At the time, you were simply being replaced by the machine. No one was offering to hire you at a lower wage, and that sucks for you too, but at least, right, there were no alternatives. And I think that's where some of this starts to get into the modern comparisons of it's not like you're being replaced by AI and there's a very clear new thing about what the AI is producing. Yes, in hindsight, we can realize the railways produced a bunch of new industries. You suddenly needed to manufacture steel. You suddenly needed to do all of the things that were cropping up as a result of coal production and energy output and new manufacturing methods. You didn't know that at the time either. And so you were simply being replaced by this machine. And I get being kind of violently angry about that.
Yeah, it's kind of what I think about a lot today too, is when I think of the Industrial Revolution, you're right, it was physical and cognitive, right? But the market saturates, right? There's all these machines, and at some point you get to the point where there's improvements, but the people making the improvements are experts. They know the intricacies and what's under the hood, so they're specially trained to make those enhancements. Everybody else is closed system. Nobody else is innovating in that space because you have to have knowledge of how it works. And it's important for our listeners to know, like people like Kevin and I, in the digital world and cognitive, so the AI revolution, right? We are always looking at requirements and features and additions to current digital solutions, right? So the market is saturated there too in sectors. So we're talking about potentially new industries or dramatic changes to existing industries that create new roles that differ than the ones that have just been replaced by AI. So
Right.
it's hard because it's saturated, right? Some of us have spent decades thinking about industries where there are 5,000 competing solutions for the same problem, right? Like when you look at big data, there's these companies and there's thousands of them, and some specialize in specific areas of data, and in many ways, data is becoming the new product, right? So it's going to be interesting. I'm having a hard time imagining this new color, right? This new innovation, this new industry that's going to create these jobs. And that's what concerns me is like, we're just not talking about it, right? Like
Right. Well,
there
and that's
might
the thing
not
is,
be one for 100 years.
right. Well, and the Industrial Revolution was a mix of both of those, right? So if you're a textile cottage industry person, you're being replaced by a machine, it's not very clear to you that eventually there will be a factory where they need a bunch of textile workers. You're going to get paid less, but at least you have a job. It's not clear to you at the time about that because you can't really see that future. If you're somebody who's working in the blacksmith world, by the time the blacksmith gets replaced, you've probably got a couple of years, but like the speed of innovation around railroads is actually astonishingly fast. And so you can see that, okay, this new thing is going to need to lay down tens of thousands, if not eventually millions of miles of track. I'm not making my blacksmith work for my local community anymore, but there's a factory job. It's going to suck a little bit, but at least, right, like you can see the path of innovation coming out of a couple of these, and that stagnates. And by the 1830s, you've consolidated and there's monopolies again. Same thing starts to happen by the middle of the early 1900s around Standard Oil and GE and all of those companies. But there are absolutely those cases where the equivalent of the thousands of big data companies all innovating, and there's plenty of work for you if you're in technology in the 2016. Same thing is true of a bunch of things. A bunch of people trying to figure out, what can I do with chemicals? What can I do with electrons? What can I do with oil? What can I do with all of these things? What can I do with coal? What can I do with spinning and manufacturing and all of these things? And so there's a ton of opportunity. Does it suck for you for the first 5 years? That's the sting. Or is it hard to see out? Depends. I struggle right now to understand what that AI future is going to look like. And maybe we're wrong. Maybe it turns out that in 10 years, AI will have generated 30 new industries and thousands of new startups that can go do all of that. And yes, there's going to be a sting and a pain point for people who lose their jobs in the next 5 years to AI, but maybe there's something good coming out of it, but I feel like the textile weaver, not like the blacksmith. I feel like the blacksmith could look and see and realize what was coming. The hand weaver was just fucked. And I feel like the white collar worker right now, I don't see what comes, I don't see the 30 new industries that AI brings about.
But here's the real criminal bit, and I'm going to sound like Kevin Newland for a second here, right? Like,
So this part I won't cut out.
we could use the AI right now to really just go after the first principle of technological utopia, right? Which is, how do we build a society where everybody has healthcare, everybody has money, everybody has a place to live, right? Everybody gets education. Like, because I feel like my version, we end up in the same destination, right? And but my version is, I think, going to be the reality, which is it becomes a political argument, and people like me are called all kinds of names and thrown out of the Conservative Party, right? Because we're talking sense, right? But it's under the guise of socialism. Oh my gosh, you're a socialist. Da, 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 and it's like, it's going to take decades for it not to be a political argument until someone finally says, no, 'cause it's an economics argument. Like, the framework of capitalism has to change. And so we could be devoting AI to actually answering some of those problems now, right? But we won't. We won't. And that's the struggle I have is, it's like everything else we do is we charge straight in, there'll be a lot of collateral damage, and then the pitchforks go out.
I mean, that is the thing, is at least the robber barons in the Gilded Age appreciated that they had to invest in education, in public libraries, in the arts. They had to do all of these things because actually they needed smarter factory workers. So they didn't do it out of any benevolent love for humanity. They did it out of selfish reasons, but the side effects were actually not the worst for the rest of society. And they avoided the pitchforks and the guillotine that time. Now, the government did have to step in, and the New Deal had to do some stuff, and the tax rate in post-World War II was a contributing factor to some of this. But yeah, there's a bunch of factors, and it feels like right now the answer is we're going to get 1860s, 1870s, 1880s level of broad immiseration, broad factory, horrifying working conditions, people barely scraping by. And the capitalists have realized they don't need to let the second class of middle class rise this time. They can just have the AI do some of that for them. And I don't know. I think they're wrong, by the way. I think AI sucks too much and isn't actually there yet. And they're going to realize they have to hire back a bunch of people. But even then, they're happy to, because they're going to hire you back at maybe not half of your salary, but 2/3 of your salary. And you still get screwed and they still get the benefit of your labor. I don't know. I'm not totally convinced. Also, robots aren't ready. So robots are still not going to, you're not going to have a robot butler anytime soon. So they still can't, I don't know. There's a bunch of pieces of this that aren't actually coming together. And I'm cautiously optimistic that in the next couple of years, the bubble bursts. The bubble bursting is going to ruin the global economy. And I don't know how we all survive that. But if I'm
Yeah.
wrong and AI actually starts to do a bunch of this kind of stuff, we're also equally screwed because the capitalists aren't afraid enough of the guillotine. And they kind of should be.
Yeah. And the complexity and the speed at some of these things that could collapse is what scares me the most. Is you think about, like, you talk about the working conditions, but mortgage industry, right? These are the consumers, like stock market, like these are investors now. They open to the stock market to day traders, right?
Yep.
These are the people spending their money. Amazon got us all hooked. We can buy all this stuff and it's delivered to our house. Those,
Technically, Walmart did that, but yes.
yeah, yeah. But it's like, these are the people who are holding that together, and they're going to be the ones who are going to be losing their jobs.
Right. Well, and that is the thing, is it's just so short-sighted. And at least, like, it's one of those weird things, at least in the Industrial Revolution, your life sucked being a factory worker, but there at least was work. And I think we'll talk about in the economic theories of there was at least work. And it wasn't good work. Your life wasn't good, but you at least were getting some kind of income. Now, could you feed yourself on that? Could you feed your family on that? Varying degrees of that. But the capitalists still did need the labor. And I think one of the things that's challenging right now, just look at the SNAP benefits being turned off, and a bunch of people, 40 million people, require the government to subsidize the employers who won't pay them enough. And so they need SNAP benefits to afford their groceries. And the lack of money coming into communities who expected the SNAP people to be buying groceries means all of the grocers are starting to suffer, and all of the communities and people and places where you would spend that money. And the idea that you're going to have massive populations of people with zero income who now also don't feed that income back into the economy, it's a self-defeating cycle. And I don't understand who the capitalists today think is going to buy their AI bot in 2032. You fired everybody who would have the income to buy the AI bot. You guys are just transferring money between each other. NVIDIA is an investor in OpenAI. OpenAI is an investor in blah. Blah is an investor in NVIDIA. Like, it's just a giant circle jerk of capital money flowing around between each other, and none of the workers get it. And at some point, they stop being able to supply the economy. And then no one's willing to do anything about that because, to your point, your retirement is in a 401k tied to the success of the stock market. And so Sam Altman telling you, I need the government to come bail me out in case things go wrong so that my stock doesn't tank and I don't ruin the stock market, means you have a vested interest now in your retirement surviving. So you need to be okay with the government bailing them out. Like, it's just a vicious fucking circle. It's just, I don't know how anyone thinks it survives and works.
Yeah, and people are asking me genuinely, like, "Hey, any advice for my kid coming out of college?" And I'm like, "Yeah, this is not like go learn the underneath the hood of this engine, right? Like in the
Right.
'80s, I could buy a book that told me how to build an engine. I'm telling you to go back to school for 6 years of math and computer science. This is,
And
or
even
maybe
that
you
they're
become
trying
a,
to replace.
yeah, even that is now going away, right? With the vibe coding. So yeah, it's very peculiar. Unless I'm missing something obvious, I'm just struggling to see where that innovation comes from. Like, if we were further ahead in so many different things, like space travel, like, hey, we're gonna go colonize other planets. Cool. Put 1 billion people out there, right? Like, let's clear out some space here. But we're not. Like,
Well, this is what I was saying at the start. It is one of those things where, like, each time this has happened in the last 200 years, it's come with a new energy source. And that new energy source has, like, been terrible for the planet, but it's at least opened doors. And we don't have that one yet, right? So we don't have fusion. We don't have stable, scalable nuclear power. We don't have something that's suddenly revolutionizing the way you think about things. And so, is there a version where robotics and some form of non-planet burning AI and some form of interesting technology and power suddenly opens the doors to a bunch of new things? I guess maybe, but yeah, it feels like we're missing components of the last two industrial revolutions. And I think we're supposed to be in the fourth one because the third one was digital and nuclear maybe, but I don't know, things are missing. I will also say, as part of all of this, in at least the current version of it, immigrants aren't your problem. You're not losing your job to the Latino person who does a bunch of work on a farm today. That's not where your white collar or your blue collar job is going. Ironically, though, in the Industrial Revolution, you did lose your job to immigrants. Immigrants were actually like a legitimate problem for the people who, now, the people who already lived here weren't, I'm not talking Native Americans, talking the white colonizers, but genuinely, the German and Irish immigrants into the country in the late 1800s was a thing that they were worried about, because at a certain point you became a skilled factory worker or a skilled artisan of certain things in the new industrial world. And then they went and found the German and Irish immigrants who they could do cheaper and who were slightly less skilled and bring those into the factory. So there's also been a constant cycle of replacing you with less skilled workers. And there's statistics. So there's an actual study that they did where the 24% increase in the US labor force between 1870 and 1910 lowered US wages by about 8%. So, genuinely, the influx of immigrants back then was a thing. Now, I don't care about the racist white people who eventually decided Germans and Irish were also white, but it is funny that there is kind of a root of, well, immigrants are here to steal your jobs. Not anymore. Not really. You're not doing that work. Sorry. You're not doing the work picking the cabbage on the farm, Gary. That's not a threat to you. But it was 100 years ago. And they were just also what you now consider white.
Just so everyone knows, when Kevin says white colonists, he means Americans. Like,
I don't. I think there's plenty of white collar workers who are also still immigrants today, and
no,
probably
no, no,
many
no.
of them do a better job.
No, the white colonists, when you were talking about the Native Americans, like the other name for those people were Americans. So
No,
not the
we're not
British.
going to
Not
get
at that
into it.
point.
Yeah.
They were Americans at that point. We had civilized. I don't think
Nope.
we had. Yeah.
No, we're not going to
We
say
had, we had,
civilized.
we had, we're not going to say civilized. Was it Gandhi when he was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? He thought it
It's
was
a
a
good
good
idea.
idea.
Let me know when it
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.